At 0516 hours, the shipping lanes near the Strait of Hormuz stopped looking like commerce and started looking like a prison. 150 vessels stacked bow to stern, lights dimmed, radios crowded, engines idling, all waiting for a corridor that didn't exist yet. Dawn was still a rumor on the eastern horizon. The sky was a bruised gray lid of low cloud with thin breaks that showed nothing but darker layers above. A northwest wind at 15 knots pushed a nervous chop across the Gulf, making anchored hulls yaw and creak against their own chain. Humidity hung heavy, turning every deck light into a halo and smearing the coastline into a dusty silhouette. Visibility was 6 nautical miles toward open water and barely 4 toward the Iranian shore, where haze and coastal glow made distance feel deceptive. The sea itself was crowded with steel, tankers carrying crude container ships with schedules collapsing by the minute, bulk carriers riding low, offshore support vessels, and warships keeping their distance while watching the same bottleneck harden into a crisis. Then the first distress call cut through the maritime net, thin and frantic. Mayday, mayday, we're stopped. No safe transit. Possible mines. We're trapped. It wasn't the only one. It was just the first that made everyone admit the truth. I'm your host at World Defense, where we break down the operations shaping global security. And what happened when 150 ships became trapped near Hormuz wasn't just another maritime disruption. It was a wake-up call for any fleet that thinks a choke point can be held hostage without triggering a response built to pry it open. Iran hadn't declared a full blockade with clean legal language. They didn't need to. They built a trap out of ambiguity, warning broadcasts, threat postures, and the oldest weapon in narrow water, mines and fear. Over the previous 12 hours, Iranian coastal units had announced restricted maritime safety operations and warned foreign warships to stay out. Patrol boats surged and then vanished back into the littoral. Unmanned surface craft were reported in the lanes. Drone flights appeared briefly over the water, then disappeared into haze. And most dangerously, 2 commercial vessels reported near-miss detonations consistent with drifting mines or improvised explosive devices, turning rumor into a physical threat that stopped traffic cold. The aggressor was Iran. The vessel type was a coordinated mix of patrol boats, small craft mine layers, and shore-based missile and radar coverage. The location was the Strait of Hormuz and its approaches, a narrow throat where the world's energy traffic compresses into predictable channels. Iran's threat package that morning included fast inshore attack craft running 40 to 47 knots in burst patterns, a Mauj-class light frigate positioned as a command node at 28 knots inside coastal clutter, and shore-based anti-ship cruise missile batteries with Qatar-class weapons capable of reaching far beyond the strait. Their goal was not necessarily to sink a carrier. Their goal was to freeze the lane, to make the sea feel unsafe, and to force the global economy to watch. On the civilian side, the effect was immediate. Captains stopped moving, insurance rates spiked in real time. Crews listened to radio warnings and watched the water like it could bite. A tanker captain 8 nautical miles south of the traffic separation scheme broadcast a simple sentence that carried more fear than any threat statement. "We will not proceed without escort." Within hours, the backlog became a steel wall. 150 ships trapped by uncertainty and the invisible logic of mines. The sea, for once, was not a highway. It was a parking lot. The United States did not treat it as a shipping problem. It treated it as a sea control problem. At the edge of the congestion, a U.S. Navy surface action group assembled to do the one thing that changes the meaning of a choke point. Open it by force of procedure and technology. The core was 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. Fast, missile-capable, and built to fight in precisely the kind of environment where threats are layered and the line between war and incident is intentionally blurred. Supporting them were MH-60R Seahawks with mine and surface search capability, maritime patrol aircraft pushing broad awareness, and explosive ordnance disposal teams staged for the worst-case scenario, clearing contact mines under hostile eyes. Iran's commanders expected hesitation. They expected politicians to argue, shipping companies to plead, and foreign navies to avoid being the first to push into a mined lane under missile umbrellas. They expected time to become their ally. What they didn't know was that the US Navy had already been tracking the aggressor for 96 hours using surveillance assets. 4 days earlier, satellite imagery had flagged unusual pier activity and small craft movements at multiple Iranian coastal points. Patterns of night departures and returns suggested rehearsal rather than routine patrol. A P-8 Poseidon operating at standoff range had mapped the surface picture and tagged likely mine layer craft by behavior and hull profile. Signals intelligence teams had monitored short-range maritime circuits and identified compressed coordination bursts consistent with mine-laying operations and coastal battery activation drills. Acoustic cueing separated unnatural small craft movement patterns from merchant noise. By the time the first commercial vessel reported a near-miss detonation, the US already had a working file. Iran was attempting to create a mine-fear corridor without ever openly admitting it had laid mines. That file mattered because it changed the response timeline. The US did not need days to decide what was happening. It needed minutes to decide what to do. At 0521 hours, the first American command message went out on maritime guard in formal, steady phrasing. All commercial vessels in the vicinity of the Strait of Hormuz. This is United States Navy. A controlled transit corridor is being established. Maintain current positions. Follow instructions from naval control units. Do not enter the traffic lane until directed. That message did two things at once. It calmed 150 crews, and it told Iran the game was about to change. Because a corridor is not a promise. It is a claim of control. At 0524 hours, the three destroyers moved. They did not sprint. They advanced at 16 to 19 knots in a deliberate wedge, spaced to overlap radar, sonar, and defensive weapons sectors. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser remained farther back to coordinate air defense and maintain broad picture while the destroyers did the dangerous close work. Overhead, the air was not empty. An E-2D Advanced Hawkeye held a wide orbit, pushing the fused picture across data links. Two MH-60R Seahawks rotated forward, their sensors scanning the sea surface for anomalies that look like mines, floating debris, or unmanned craft. The corridor opening was not a single act. It was a sequence. Step 1. Define the box. Step 2. Clear the box. Step 3. Protect the box. Step 4. Move civilians through the box. At 0527 hours, the lead destroyer broadcast again, this time directed toward suspected Iranian patrol craft that had been orbiting the lane at the edge of visibility. Iranian small craft, this is United States Navy warship. Maintain safe distance from the designated transit corridor. Any interference will be treated as hostile intent. There was no reply. There was movement. At 0528 hours and 19 seconds, surface radar picked up multiple fast contacts accelerating from the Iranian littoral. Surface contacts bearing 042 to 058, range 20 nautical miles, speed 41 knots and increasing. Iran was testing the corridor before it existed. The American response did not break pace. It layered defense while continuing the clearance mission. One destroyer held forward as the corridor spearhead. The second moved to block the northern lane. The third shifted to a covering position designed to keep any patrol craft outside the corridor's flanks. The Hawkeye refined the picture and confirmed the contacts were small craft, not merchant vessels. At 0529 hours, the first mine search pattern began. An MH-60R Seahawk descended to low altitude and began a systematic scan along the corridor line. It was not doing magic. It was doing method. Multi-mode radar sweeps, infrared checks for unnatural surface objects, and visual confirmation where possible. Behind it, an explosive ordnance disposal team aboard a support craft prepared for a contact investigation if a suspicious object was found. At 0530 hours and 11 seconds, the Seahawk crew called the first anomaly. Possible floating object. Bearing 091. Range 800 meters off corridor centerline. Marking. A floating mine is not always a mine. In these waters, it can be a buoy, debris, a fishing net. The difference is whether you assume. The US did not assume. It treated every anomaly like a threat until proven otherwise. At 0530 hours and 44 seconds, the lead destroyer slowed slightly, held standoff, and deployed a small unmanned surface vehicle to investigate. The drone boat moved forward under remote control, its sensors and cameras feeding back live. In the dark water, it approached the object with slow, careful certainty. At 0531 hours and 26 seconds, the camera showed it. A spherical shape, low in the water, metallic, with protrusions consistent with contact mine horns. No dramatic moment, just a confirmation that fear had a physical form. On the net, the destroyer's voice stayed calm. Mine confirmed, marked. Corridor adjustment 200 meters south. EOD preparing neutralization. At 0532 hours, the first neutralization was executed. A controlled charge was placed and detonated at standoff. The mine disappeared in a plume of water and a brief flash. The shockwave rolled across the surface and slapped the nearest hulls, a warning to every civilian captain watching from a mile away that the corridor was being carved by force. Iran's small craft surge hit its first decision point at the same time. At 0532 hours and 18 seconds, the Iranian boats crossed 12 nautical miles from the corridor line, running 43 to 46 knots in a wide fan. Their intent was clear: force the Americans to stop corridor work and deal with the swarm. Force delays, force headlines, forced out. The US refused the trade. At 0532 hours and 33 seconds, the second destroyer issued a final warning. Iranian small craft, turn away now. You are entering weapons engagement criteria. No compliance. At 0532 hours and 47 seconds, controlled warning bursts cratered the water 150 meters ahead of the lead boat's bow, walking splashes like a ruler across its path. The lead boat hesitated, the first crack in confidence, and then turned away. Two boats followed. A third tried to keep closing for another 5 seconds, the kind of stubbornness that gets men killed. At 0533 hours and 02 seconds, the destroyer executed precision disablement. Round struck the craft's engine housing. Its wake collapsed. Speed fell from 44 knots to 14 in 6 seconds. The boat yawed in the chop and began to drift. The rest of the Iranian boats broke away. They did not want to fight. They wanted to pause. The US denied them both. At 0533 hours, the corridor work continued. The Seahawk resumed scanning. The unmanned surface vehicle shifted to the next waypoint. The lead destroyer pushed forward. EOD prepared for the next object. At 0534 hours and 11 seconds, a second anomaly was found. This one deeper, partially submerged, drifting at the edge of the corridor line. The Seahawk marked it. The drone boat investigated. The camera confirmed another mine. At 0535 hours, the second neutralization charge detonated, 2 mines down. But mines are not the only threat in Hormuz. Mines are the fear tool. Missiles are the punishment tool. If Iran wanted to stop a corridor, the next step would be to threaten it from shore. At 0535 hours and 46 seconds, electronic support measures on the forward destroyer flagged a shift in coastal emissions, a tightening of radar patterns consistent with targeting behavior. A coastal battery was waking up. On the US net, the Air Defense Commander issued the cold instruction that keeps sailors alive. All stations, missile defense posture, assume coastal launch within 5 minutes. Defensive systems spun up. Phalanx CIWS mounts stabilized and slewed. RIM-116 RAM launchers indexed toward the threat sector. Medium-range interceptors were prepared. Decoy systems were armed. The corridor could not exist if the escorts were forced to dodge a missile while civilian ships sat exposed. The US solution was layered pressure. At 0536 hours, an EA-18G Growler moved into a forward orbit to watch and shape the electromagnetic space, ready to disrupt coastal fire control. The Hawkeye pushed updated emitter bearings to the destroyers. The destroyers did not fire first. They prepared to end the moment Iran committed. Iran hesitated because the corridor was working. At 0537 hours, the US declared the initial corridor segment cleared for controlled transit, not the entire strait, but a narrow, monitored lane wide enough to move ships in single file with escort control. The first commercial ships did not move immediately. Captains wanted proof. They wanted to see a ship go through and not explode. So the US did the only thing that convinces sailors: it put steel in front. At 0538 hours, the lead Arleigh Burke destroyer entered the corridor and proceeded at 14 knots, bow on, lights controlled, sensors sweeping, mine countermeasure patterns active, helicopters overhead. If a mine remained, the destroyer would find it first. That was the point. At 0540 hours, the first tanker began to follow at 8 knots, guided by naval radio instructions and corridor markers. Then another ship, then 2 more. The backlog began to loosen, not with a rush, but with controlled motion. The kind of motion that tells a hostile shoreline that the sea is being reclaimed. Iran tried to disrupt the optics one last time. At 0541 hours and 22 seconds, 2 unmanned surface craft were detected drifting toward the corridor line. Low-profile objects designed to look like debris until they were close. The Seahawk spotted them first on infrared, faint heat signatures and unnatural movement. The destroyer's gunnery teams watched through stabilized optics. The USV investigator moved toward one and confirmed the shape. Small, unmanned craft with possible explosive payload. At 0542 hours, both drones were neutralized with controlled fire at standoff, shredding them before they could reach the corridor. The explosions were small but visible, flashes against gray water that every civilian captain saw from a mile away. The Gulf lit up in brief pulses, but the corridor stayed open. By 0547 hours, 10 ships had moved into controlled transit. By 0555 hours, 30. The trapped number began to shrink, and with it, Iran's leverage. At 0604 hours, the escort commander transmitted the message that ended the crisis phase. Commercial traffic, this is United States Navy. Transit corridor remains active. Maintain spacing. Follow instructions. Safe passage will be enforced. Enforced. That word mattered, because enforcement is the difference between a promise and a capability. Iran's outcome was not what it wanted. The choke point had not become a hostage. The mine fear had been neutralized by method. The small craft harassment had been boxed and disabled. The unmanned craft trick had been seen and destroyed. Coastal targeting behavior had been met with a missile defense posture that made launches unattractive. By mid-morning, more than half of the 150 ships had moved. The rest were staged for controlled transit. The corridor was not just open, it was living, watched by helicopters, guarded by destroyers, shaped by electronic warfare, and backed by the quiet threat that any coastal site that fired would invite immediate counterstrike. The lesson is ruthless and modern. In 2026, you can trap ships with fear only until a navy arrives that can turn fear into a checklist. Mines are not magic. They are objects. Objects can be detected, marked, and neutralized when the right tools and procedures are applied. Swarm tactics are not dominance. They are noise, and noise can be boxed when the defender owns the geometry. Unmanned tricks are not surprise when the air layer has infrared eyes and the surface layer has discipline. And the final lesson is the one choke points keep teaching. You do not close a strait with threats. You close it only if you can hold it against a force that can clear, defend, and move commerce through under fire. That morning near Hormuz, 150 ships were trapped until a US Navy rescue corridor was opened. Not with one dramatic act, with layered control, with procedure that looks boring until it saves the world's economy, and with the quiet, overwhelming truth that sea power is not the ability to threaten, it is the ability to move. But the corridor did not stay safe by declaration alone. Once the first waves of civilian ships began moving, the risk shifted from mine strike in an empty lane to mine strike inside a convoy, where a single detonation could jam the corridor with a burning hull and return the entire traffic picture to paralysis. At 0612 hours, the US escorts began running the corridor like a moving conveyor belt. The lead destroyer maintained the cleared line. A second destroyer held a parallel lane offset by 1.2 nautical miles to provide immediate rescue and tow capability if a civilian ship lost propulsion. The third destroyer rotated to the rear of the convoy, acting as a gatekeeper and ensuring spacing discipline so that no ship was forced to slow abruptly and bunch up into a target-rich cluster. Overhead, the Seahawks changed tactics from search and mark to shadow and verify. One helicopter flew ahead of the convoy, scanning the next 6 nautical miles of corridor for floating anomalies and unmanned craft. The second helicopter flew abeam, watching the littoral and tracking any small craft movement that looked like a sudden surge. When fuel cycles forced one Seahawk to return, another launched in its place. The corridor never lost its eyes. At 0631 hours, Iran attempted a final political gambit. A coastal broadcast claiming the corridor was unsafe and warning civilians that the United States would be responsible for any accidents. The statement was designed to resurrect fear without firing a shot. The response from the sea was stronger than any press release. Ships kept moving. At 0644 hours, a third mine was discovered. This one snagged in floating debris near the corridor's southern edge, exactly where a slow-turning tanker might drift if it had to adjust for spacing. The Seahawk marked it. The unmanned surface vehicle confirmed it. EOD neutralized it with a controlled detonation at 0649 hours. The convoy did not stop. It adjusted spacing, held course, and continued. At 7:10 hours, the Hawkeye reported the coastal emitter pattern drop again, not because Iran had surrendered, but because it had learned the most painful lesson of coercion. If you turn your threats on, you make yourself targetable. That is why the corridor held. It was not only cleared, it was backed by consequences. By 0800 hours, the trapped count had fallen below 30. By 0835, below 12. And by 0917 hours, the corridor had become routine enough that shipping captains stopped calling it a rescue and started calling it what it really was: restored freedom of navigation. That transformation is the real power of sea control. It turns crisis into routine. It turns fear into schedule. It takes a choke point an adversary tried to weaponize and makes it boring again. And boring, at sea, is victory.